The chamber carried an energy unlike any other day, tense, suffocating, and charged with the anticipation of confrontation. Donald Trump sat in the front row, shoulders squared, arms folded tightly across his chest, radiating a mix of defiance and impatience. His presence alone dominated the room. Cameras rolled, reporters scribbled notes, and aides lined the walls, their eyes darting nervously from one senator to the next. This wasn't just another Senate session. It was a test of loyalty, one that Trump believed he would pass with ease. For months, Trump had been fighting battles on every front, the media, the courts, even factions within his own party. But he believed his grip on Senate leadership was secure. He had leaned heavily on John Thune, the Senate Minority Whip, as a key player to hold the line, to ensure no cracks widened in the Republican ranks. Thune had always been there, at least outwardly, delivering the talking points, backing the agenda, and keeping the conference steady. Trump considered him reliable, a man who understood the value of staying in lockstep with the movement that had reshaped American politics. But politics has a cruel way of shattering illusions. When Thune rose to speak, the air shifted instantly. Conversations died, pens stopped scratching, and even the low hum of cameras seemed to fade. There was something in his posture, firm, upright, shoulders squared with unusual resolve, that hinted this was no ordinary statement. Trump's eyes narrowed, studying him, almost daring him to confirm the unease that suddenly gripped the room. Mr. President, Thune began, his voice controlled but not hesitant, I've stood by this party through its victories and its defeats. I've defended it against critics and fought for its future. But today, I must speak plainly, because our path is no longer clear. Our loyalty cannot be to one man, no matter how powerful, no matter how popular. Our loyalty must be to America, to the Constitution, to the principles that define us as Republicans, and to the people who depend on us to lead with integrity. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. Heads turned toward Trump, whose jaw clenched visibly, his face darkening as the words landed. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk in front of him, his knuckles white. It wasn't just what Thune was saying, it was the fact that he was saying it here, publicly, in front of Trump, the Senate, and the cameras broadcasting live to the nation. This party, Thune continued, his voice growing stronger, cannot be shackled to division, to grievances, and to a politics that demands blind allegiance. If we are to endure, if we are to grow, then we must have the courage to step beyond the shadow of one individual, no matter how great his influence may be. This is not betrayal. This is survival. This is truth. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the faint clicking of camera shutters seemed to pause, as if the entire room had frozen in shock. Trump's lips curled into a scowl, his finger rising to point directly at Thune. John, Trump barked, his voice sharp and cutting, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. Do you hear me? The biggest mistake. You think the people, my people, will stand with you after this? They won't. They'll see you for what you are, a coward, a traitor, someone too weak to stand and fight when the fight matters most. Trump's words sliced through the silence, but the force of them failed to break the strange stillness that hung over the chamber. Senators exchanged uneasy glances, staffers whispered nervously among themselves, and the weight of the moment seemed to settle on every shoulder. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was a fracture, one that could shatter the fragile unity holding the Republican Party together. For a moment, Thune held Trump's glare, his face impassive, neither defiant nor apologetic, but firm in his resolve. He knew what this meant. He knew the headlines that would follow, the fury that would rain down from Trump's base, the calls and threats that would flood his office within hours. But he didn't waver. He had drawn the line, and there would be no retreat. Trump sat back in his chair, breathing heavily, his fury uncontained. The air was thick with confrontation, every second dragging with unbearable tension. And then, just as murmurs began to rise, just as the fragile silence threatened to splinter, a new voice cut through. It came from further down the row. Calm, controlled, unshaken. J.D. Vance slowly rose from his seat, the weight of every eye turning to him. He didn't rush, didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, letting the silence stretch until the room itself seemed to bend around him. The betrayal had been delivered. Trump had fired back. But now, with everyone waiting, J.D. Vance prepared to deliver the response that would define the moment. J.D. Vance rose with a deliberate calm that immediately shifted the atmosphere. The chamber, already thick with tension from Thune's stunning break and Trump's furious rebuttal, seemed to freeze in anticipation. All eyes turned toward the freshman senator from Ohio, the Marine, the author, the unlikely politician who had once been skeptical of Trump but had since become one of his most vocal defenders. Nobody quite knew what he would say, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. He stood silently for a few seconds, surveying the room, his expression unreadable. The pause was intentional. Vance had always understood something most politicians didn't. Silence, when wielded correctly, had more power than shouting. By the time he finally opened his mouth, the room was so still that even the faint buzz of the cameras seemed to echo. "John," he began, his voice low and measured, "you speak of integrity. You speak of survival. But let's not pretend this is about principle. This is about convenience. When the people cried out for answers on corruption, when small towns were hollowed out and left behind, when families were destroyed by policies written in back rooms of this very city, where was your integrity then? Where was your survival instinct for the millions of Americans who had nothing left but anger and despair?" The words struck with surgical precision. Thune shifted in his seat, the confidence he had exuded only moments earlier beginning to wither under the weight of the accusation. Trump, meanwhile, leaned back, watching intently, a flicker of satisfaction breaking through his scowl. Vance continued, his tone sharpening. "Donald Trump may not be perfect. None of us are. But let's be clear, he gave those people something Washington never gave them, a voice. He went to the places politicians forgot. He listened when no one else cared to listen. And you would have us believe that rejecting him, in the name of principle, is somehow an act of courage." Murmurs rippled across the chamber, faint but undeniable. Senators who had remained silent began exchanging glances. Staffers leaned closer, eager not to miss a word. Vance's voice, steady and unyielding, cut through the room like a blade. "This isn't about one man. This is about millions of Americans who've been told they don't matter. Farmers, factory workers, veterans, families drowning under inflation while this city writes checks to everyone but them. They're not loyal to Trump because they worship him. They're loyal because, for once, someone was loyal to them. And if we abandon them, then this party doesn't just lose an election. It loses its soul." The force of his words landed like a hammer. Trump nodded subtly, almost imperceptibly, his usual bluster replaced by something closer to gratitude. For once, he wasn't the one carrying the fight, Vance was carrying it for him. Thune's face tightened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. Vance had taken the moral ground and turned it on him with brutal efficiency. Every argument about survival now sounded hollow against the charge of abandonment. Then came Vance's final blow, the line that would linger long after the session ended. His voice grew heavier, the gravity unmistakable. "History doesn't remember those who looked for the easy way out. It doesn't honor those who bowed their heads when the moment called for courage. History remembers the ones who stood, when standing carried the highest cost." The chamber fell utterly silent. Not a shuffle, not a whisper, not even the cough of a distracted aide. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, that pressed down on everyone like an invisible hand, demanding they acknowledge what had just been said. Trump turned slightly toward Vance, his eyes locked on him, the anger from earlier replaced by something almost foreign to him, respect. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. When Vance finally lowered himself back into his chair, the moment lingered like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Thune looked down, avoiding Trump's gaze. Senators on both sides of the aisle sat frozen, some shaken, others secretly impressed, all aware that they had just witnessed a defining fracture in the party, and perhaps the first true glimpse of J.D. Vance's rising power. The betrayal had been shocking. Trump's fury had been predictable. But Vance's response, it had brought the entire room to silence, the kind of silence that meant nothing would be the same again.